I'm going to give you a little bit of an intro in regards to the zeitgeist that we find ourselves in and within which the need for these types of research and reports has arisen. And then after that, I will be talking to the author of the report, Johan van der Merwe, to give you just a little bit more detail on why what is inside the report and some of the big revelations. So firstly, I think something that needs to be understood is when it comes to a race obsession in South Africa, the world is taking notice. We've seen a lot of international coverage regarding not only hatred and violence being instigated against minorities in South Africa. We've also seen an increase in focus on the race obsession and racial discrimination in South Africa, specifically coming from the main culprit, the South African government, or more specifically, the ruling party, the ANC. So within this context, it's always very important to have solid sources when anyone, whether abroad or within South Africa, comes forward and asks, where can I learn more? Where can I read more about specifically the race laws and racial discrimination perpetrated by the South African government? And when that opportunity arises, you can't be empty-handed. You should be able to provide them with solid information and research. Many of you here have already done a lot of that type of research. You've already also created sources that can be used in this regard. But from AfriForum's side, when we see increased attention being paid to specifically the racial discrimination of the South African government, you need even more sources created, sources of information and solid research. That's what we tried with this report, and I hope that it is a valuable contribution to the broader debate and discussion regarding systemic racism in South Africa. So what is systemic racism? Well, systemic racism is defined as a form of racism or racial discrimination that is embedded in the laws and regulations of a society, with one of its main manifestations being racially discriminatory hiring practices. By this metric, South Africa has a huge systemic racism problem. It should not be labeled reverse racism either. That doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is racism itself. I don't know where that term comes from, but it's a redundant term. It doesn't exist. There's only racism. There's not something like reverse racism. Race obsession has infected almost every facet of South African society, whether it be the corporate hiring practices that we see or school rugby team selection, even on a primary school level. The debate last year over Dis-Chem's racially discriminatory hiring practices highlighted the fact that some never really regarded racial discrimination as wrong in principle. It is a strange state of affairs when those standing up to racially discriminatory hiring practices are the ones being labeled by some as the racists. Well, that tide is very quickly turning. There's a very strong growth in the opposition to racial discrimination in South Africa based on principle, not just based on who it is being perpetrated against. A question that needs to be asked is why those who champion racially discriminatory policies cannot bring themselves to straightforwardly call it what it is. I think all of you probably already know the answer why. They use apologetics and they use rosy words like transformation, redress, or corrective action. How can you be against corrective action? Well, that's how it is framed. How can you be against justice? Well, that debate is shifting now. We are calling it what it is, not as what it is framed as. A constructive, honest debate on this matter will only be possible once the proponents of racial discrimination can bring themselves to drop the euphemisms. Their framing of the issues are no longer accepted. We are now calling it what it is, racially discriminatory policies perpetrated by a government. AfriForum and others opposing the South African government's many race laws are standing on solid principled ground. Racial discrimination was wrong in the past and it is wrong in the present. Those rushing to the defense of this positive discrimination, as they call it, on the other hand, are occupying very precarious ground. That's why they have to constantly play language games rather than debate the actual issue. Now I must ask, how do you explain to a child going to primary school that they did not make the netball team because they have the wrong skin color? How can you, with a clean conscience, tell a small business owner that is on the verge of bankruptcy due to a pandemic, and more specifically the government's illogical lockdowns, that they're not going to qualify for relief funds that have been allocated for specifically businesses in their position because their ownership is just the wrong complexion? How can you genuinely, with a working moral compass, tell an organization that fights gender-based violence that they do not qualify for funding from the government because their management has white skin? And how can you look an employee in the eye that has qualified for his position, has qualified for a promotion, or someone that has approached your business in regards to an employment opportunity? How can you look them in the eye and say, yes, you deserve the promotion or you deserve the job, but your skin color is not correct? You have the wrong type of skin color. All of these examples that I have listed happened in the last 2 years. And these are only single examples of these atrocious racial discrimination that has happened in many cases. These are not isolated incidents. None of these examples I had to go and think up as an hypothetical. They all happened. You can research every single one of them. So government-mandated racially discriminatory hiring practices are nothing more than a mirage of a solution for a real problem. The real problem is a government that has absolutely failed to address many crises: an unemployment crisis, economic growth crisis, electricity generation crisis, an education crisis, and a corruption crisis. Filling a pothole by digging a new one is not the answer. The time has come for a broader critical debate on racially discriminatory policies and legislation in South Africa. This report by AfriForum seeks to contribute to that debate that is already gaining momentum, because the time is ripe. Because after more than 100 years of racially discriminatory policies and legislation by the government, which have continued into the 21st century, do not allow anyone to deny that fact, it is high time for the retirement of this abhorrent practice and the immediate stopping of any grasping at straws to try and justify its continuation in the 21st century. Therefore, I'm also joined, I don't just have the report here with me, I have the author of the report here, Johan van der Merwe. Thank you very much for this report. I specifically asked Johan, I know there's a lot to cover, but please don't write a 500-page report, even if there is enough information to write an entire book on this topic. Keep it short, keep it nice to the details, and make it accessible to anyone that wants to read or wants more information on racially discriminatory policies in South Africa. And I think Johan has absolutely achieved that, and that's a great achievement. So Johan, welcome, and thank you very much for your time. We're just going to be covering some of the smaller details within the report and maybe answering some of your questions if you have them. Welcome, Johan, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much.